I'm Mackenzie, Vice President of External Affairs for Midas. We have Haley Ramber on and Shelley Bennett as well. And thank you to Women in Mining and the others who helped put on this event today. From a company where 33% of our workforce is women or is made up of women, we are very, very proud to represent this future of where mining is going. So thank you again. So Haley and I are going to kind of bounce around a little bit. We're going to go really quickly. This is a big project, and in an hour, it's difficult to cover everything. But as they mentioned, there's a question function to help us answer your questions, should you have any, and we'll stop a couple of times to go ahead and answer a couple of questions. But when we talk about this project, there are really three things that we talk about. The first is that this project was designed to repair legacy environmental impacts from over 100 years of mining at site. The second is it'll supply antimony, which is a critical mineral. And the third is that it's bringing over 500 direct jobs to rural Idaho. So one of the questions we get most often is, who is Midas Gold? Midas Gold is comprised of two companies. Midas Gold Idaho is the company you see here in front of you. The 35 people predominantly based here in Idaho. As you saw, most of us are Idahoans. And this is the company who designed the project, is moving it forward through the NEPA process, and we own the assets. Then we have Midas Gold Corp. Midas Gold Corp is based in Vancouver, Canada. There are 4 people in that company, and they are really focused predominantly on the fact that it's a publicly traded company, traded on the Toronto Stock Exchange. So that parent company is really focused on the financed side, whereas Midas Gold Idaho, located and headquartered here in Idaho, is focused on the project. And we're a team of experts and people who care passionately about Idaho. This company is also a reflection of who we are and our values. So as a company, we have dedicated ourselves to safety, environmental responsibility, community involvement, transparency, accountability, integrity, and performance. And these are the things that we live out every single day. And as a result, we get to do really cool things on our team. So part of what Haley and Shelley and I do is really figure out how we should be engaging in our communities. How are we partnering? And most importantly, how are we listening? And so, in part, one of Haley's jobs has been to take people up to tours of site. And last year alone, pre-COVID, she conducted over 30 tours. And when you see just how far Stibnite is away from civilization, 30 tours is a big deal. Over the last 2 years, getting over 900 people onto site, boots on the ground. She also has spent dedicated hours, over 700 hours in classrooms, in local rural classrooms, doing STEM education. So we really see ourselves as integrated into the community as tightly as we can be. So a little bit about Stibnite. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Stibnite, it's in central Idaho. So I'm located here in Boise, down at the bottom of the map, and Haley is in Donley, which is right between McCall and Cascade. And so if you were to travel from Boise to Cascade, it's about an hour and a half. From Cascade, you would then go up Warm Lake Road, and you would either take the South Fork Road or you would take Johnson Creek Road to what you see on the map is the village of Yellow Pine. There are about 20 people who live in Yellow Pine full year round. Then it's a 14-mile journey from Yellow Pine to Stibnite. So we are very remote. One question we get a lot is, are we in the wilderness? No, but you can see that the Frank Church Wilderness is close to the project, but it is about 3 miles away. In fact, when they created those wilderness boundaries, they specifically created them around Stibnite and Thunder Mountain to make sure that those mineral resources were preserved. So there is a long history of mining at Stibnite. Mining here first started in about the 1890s with what in Idaho we call the Thunder Mountain Gold Rush. The site was first examined, or people were mining for gold, silver, tungsten, and antimony. But the real mining at Stibnite didn't happen until World War II, when, interestingly, the blockade in the Pacific cut off the US supply of tungsten and antimony. And at that point, the US government had identified the potential sources of antimony and tungsten at Stibnite. And they contracted with the Bradley Mining Company, and the town of Stibnite grew to over 1,000 people. And by the end of at the end of the war, the Stibnite mining district had produced most of the tungsten and antimony for World War II. So most of the mining up here occurred long before there were environmental regulations or requirements on how to leave it. And it was definitely done during a different ethos. The goal here was we've got to win the war, not we've got to take care of our river. And so as a result, there are some real legacies at Stibnite. But the positive legacy is the fact that the mining that occurred during World War II is actually credited with having shortened World War II by a year and having saved 1 million American lives. And that's an incredible legacy that we don't talk enough about how the minerals that we can produce here can have this really significant impact on our country and on our communities. And unfortunately, there's also the other side of that coin that happened in the past, which is the environmental legacies. So when you look here at this map of what Stibnite is today, you'll see the lighter color is the footprint of historic disturbance. The main aspects that we talk about when we look at the historic legacy of Stibnite is first the Yellow Pine Pit. So today, the East Fork of the South Fork of the Salmon River dumps directly into this pit, blocking fish migration from happening. There is degraded water quality because over 10.5 million tons of spent ore and tailings are lying in this valley unlined, interacting with both ground and surface water. And then we have some other disturbances that have dramatically reduced water habitat and natural ground terrestrial habitat as well. And Haley will talk a little bit more about these. So when our company came in 2009, 2010, we knew this was a disturbed site. Mining hadn't happened here for about 20 years. And there had been 3 circlet decrees that essentially said everybody gets to walk away. So when we looked at it, we knew that there was still mineral potential. But we knew that if anyone was ever going to get to that mineral potential, they were going to have to design a project that also put first and foremost the repairing the legacy environmental issues at Stibnite. And that is the core of our company and the core of how we designed our project. So when we set out to design the Stibnite Gold Project, we submitted our plan of restoration and operations to the U.S. Forest Service, the Payette office, in September of 2016. And the design that we submitted after about 7 years of study looked at and accomplished in our minds who we wanted to be and what we wanted this project to do. We wanted to make sure we were good stewards. We wanted to minimize our impact by keeping our footprint as much as we could onto that historically disturbed footprint. We wanted to leave the area better. And so we decided to do that by actually addressing some of the legacy areas first and designing mining around what we wanted it to look like at the end. And then, of course, safety first, about how we would engineer and design our own practices and our own infrastructure to put public safety, and then, of course, the safety of our workforce foremost. So I think now Haley's going to walk through a few of the examples of the legacies and our approach to them within the project design.
Perfect. Thank you, Mackenzie. So this is essentially like a virtual tour of going to Stibnite with me. So what you're looking at right here is one of the predominant legacy issues that we call at site. So this is something left from past mining. So what we're looking at, this nice incision, is actually pretty significant when you start looking at the scale of things up at site. So this is Blowout Creek. So you can actually see kind of up at the base over here, this was actually once an earthen dam that provided hydroelectric power to mining and milling operations up at Stibnite. Ultimately, it was left unattended when it wasn't needed, and it actually failed in 1965. And this failure essentially is now the resulting cause of the primary source of sedimentation in the entire watershed is coming from this location. So we have a plan for this. So this is something, so this area was never mined, but it was an area that was essentially impacted due to mining and past operations. So off to the left, you can see these current conditions that I was just talking about. And so we have a solution for that. So we feel that results are best done up front, and you'll notice this in a lot of the actions of our project, is putting the environment at the forefront. So this is an issue left behind that we can address right away during construction. So we actually proposed to build a French drain system. So we'll be reestablishing and regradiating this hillside, which ultimately dropped the water table 14 feet when this dam failed. So not only The primary source of sedimentation in the entire watershed is coming from here, but it's ultimately impacting a lot of the environmental conditions around it. So during construction phase of the Stibnite Gold Project, we'll actually be installing a French drain system that ultimately leads us to the right side of your screen, which is restoration, meaning we're not letting it stabilize and kind of just sit where it's at because it checks the box, but really how can we bring it back to a pristine area and where it needs to be? And that long-term stabilization and that solution ultimately is improving overall water quality, not just at our mine site, but in the entire watershed, and stabilizing that water table back to where it needed to be. And you'll have to bear with us on the delay. The perks of working from a virtual world is high-speed internet here in Donley, and so as we're transitioning. The next component, this is actually called the SODA. So this is the spent ore disposal area, is the picture that you see here. And it was one of those legacy features that Mackenzie showed you earlier on that map. The spent ore disposal area is the primary source, so it's 10.5 million tons of tailings and spent ore that is unlined sitting in the headwaters. So this is past mining from heap leach operations, from underground, all of this material has ended up here. Still unlined, it does have this cap that you see, this darker matrix over the top. And then the lighter matrix that you see underneath is actually the tailings itself. And this is left at site. Our plan, so again, this is an aerial photo off to the left of current site conditions of what that spent ore disposal area looks like. In our plan, we actually have built it around reprocessing and repurposing all 10.5 million tons of this waste rock that's currently sitting unlined up at Stibnite. So the 3 million tons of the historic tailings, we can actually reprocess, so we can actually push those through our mill that we will have in our project. And then when we say repurpose, that 7.5 million tons of this spent heap leach ore, so we're removing the existing source of water degrading qualities that are going on in these tailings and in this heap leach ore, but we're also finding better places for them. So we essentially use it as construction and development rock. Why this is important. So this is a pretty significant feature up at Stibnite that is left from past mining, but it's also an existing impacted footprint. So another key component of our project is that we've actually built it so that we're minimizing the creation of new impacts of unimpacted land up at Stibnite. And so this will also be the location of our lined tailing storage facility. So that's a pretty key component. So we're cleaning up what's left behind, we're stabilizing, and then we're bringing it to where it needs to be for our project moving forward. The third, so this is kind of the hot spot, and what Stibnite is predominantly known for is the yellow pine pit. So as those intro slides, any projects, if you plugged it into Google right now, Stibnite, Idaho, a picture of the yellow pine pit is going to pop up. So the yellow pine pit was actually an underground operations that transitioned to open pit mining, ultimately really for the push for the antimony and tungsten that was going on. It also has a pretty impressive grade of gold bearing ore. When it made the transition from underground to open pit mining, it ultimately blocked salmon passage, and because they had to divert the east fork of the south fork of the Salmon River around this pit so that they could transition to open pit mining. So we'll transition to the next slide. So this off to the left is current site conditions. So once they were done mining the yellow pine pit, they essentially put the east fork of the south fork, they put it back. What does that mean? Well, you see this kind of small scaled cascading waterfall there. That actually has almost a 25% gradient, so it's way, way too steep for our anadromous fish in our area to actually get past it, let alone the amount of water during spawning habitat as well. So current site conditions, we have this pit that is essentially being backfilled with the sediment that is coming from upsite. It's also blocking fish passage, but it's also one of the 3 proposed pits that we plan in mining. One of them that is actually a remining of an existing pit. So a key component in addressing in this project was we have blocked fish passage, and it's a pretty big issue that's been going on in our area and in our state, is how can we increase suitable, adaptable spawning and rearing habitat but how can we be a part of a solution? Whereas Stibnite right now is essentially not, the fish passage is blocked. So our team developed a fish tunnel. It is a 0.9 mile fish tunnel that essentially will divert, so the current river around the Yellow Pine pit, so starting during construction, but not just as a river diversion. This allows for fish access starting before we ever start mining. So this is a fully functional tunnel before we ever mine an ounce of gold. So when you start thinking about restoration, that's probably one of the best examples you can come up with, is how can you, before we ever become a profiting company, find a solution of this scale. This fish tunnel is pretty impressive. We have some slides later on that I'll go over from a fisheries perspective. But in my personal background and what got me excited about this project, as an Idahoan, as a geologist, this was one of the biggest components, is how can a company, that has a pretty significant resource of, when it comes to gold and antimony and silver, have such a top priority for fish restoration in a state where it matters so much to us. So ultimately that fish diversion stays in there until about year 7. And so we actually start backfilling this Yellow Pine pit. So when we talk about true restoration, that fish tunnel is an interim fix, right? It's not the long-term solution. The overall long-term solution of this pit in this area is restoring the East Fork of the South Fork of the Salmon River back to where it needs to be. So that's fish passing without any assistance, and it's clean, pristine area. So it's reestablishing of that habitat.
Right, which begins in year 7. So far, we're not waiting to the end of the project to make these things happen. So as Haley described, the way we've built this project is on the notion that the environment and industry can be working together. So by bringing in $1 billion investment that it's going to be to build this project, we can also satisfy the environmental needs of site, which today there are no other viable options. I think the only thing that would be on the table was that someday this would rise to the top of Superfund funding to get cleaned up. So really, by the economic investment, by the expertise and the tools that we can bring to site, we can make these really great things happen for the region. So what are those economic factors of site? So primarily we are mining for gold and antimony, and there's a little bit of silver as well. Right now we know that we can recover over 4 million ounces of gold and about 100 million pounds of antimony. Now we all know about gold. I think what we don't talk about enough is the fact that it is really in our everyday technology and use. There is 50 cents worth of gold in the cell phone you are using. It is in medical technology that is critical to people in our lives. It is, because it is compatible, it's in things like pacemakers. And then, so it's in technology, and it's absolutely something we need. And the question that I usually pose is, if we're going to be using gold, we need to be making sure that it's being produced in a way that we can feel good about here in our country. And antimony is a critical mineral, listed as one of the 35 critical minerals by the USGS and Department of Commerce. Right now, I would bet most of everybody is not aware of what antimony is. Antimony is a fire retardant and a metal strengthener. That was its value during World War II as well. So right now you can find antimony in your computer. You can find it in lead acid batteries. You can find it in the plastics that cover wiring. You can find it in your carpet and textiles at home to make it fire retardant. So it really is one of those things that is everywhere and has multiple uses in our everyday lives. But right now, there are no domestically mined sources of antimony. We typically, as a country, are able to recycle or recover about 15% of our actual antimony usage through recycling. Otherwise, we're importing it in. And again, it's China that owns, I believe it's well over 70% of the world, or 80% of the world's antimony. So a little bit about the project footprint. So as I mentioned, we've done as much as we can to really ensure that we've reduced the new project footprint to be as much as possible on the historic footprint. So what you'll see here, the hatched areas in this map, that's the historic disturbance. The light pinkish mauve color is the footprint for our Stibnite Gold Project. And then of course the overlay, that dark purple, is where our infrastructure overlays the historic disturbance. So the two large wings of the lighter pink that you see, that's really our storage facility on top, our rock storage rock facility on top, and then down the bottom, that's our tailings storage facility. So these are large features that are very difficult to change locations of, especially when you want to make sure that they're in the right, kind of most stable spots of site. The dashed line you'll see coming in is the power line, and then the road is the red line that we would be bringing in there. So Haley kind of touched on this a little bit, but as we go through our talk, two definitions that are really important to us: reclamation and restoration. So reclamation, as you all know, are the requirements by law of a mining company or otherwise to recreate stable and static conditions once they are done. And restoration, how we define it, is really more about how we create a system that is dynamic and resilient once we're done, a system that much more parallels or mimics natural conditions. And these two photos are really good examples of that. So whereas on the left-hand side, you see a rock-lined channel, that is currently Meadow Creek on site. This is an example of previous reclamation work at Stibnite, and this was here to keep Meadow Creek away from those unlined tailings. So you can see, it's not great habitat, but it's kind of doing the job that it was set out to do. Whereas the restoration standard, here you'll see an illustration of how we design the recreation of the East Fork of the South Fork of the Salmon River once we're done. So it's really looking at a system that mimics those natural conditions. And that's the value we've set for ourselves in designing the project. It's not just, let's check the box. Instead, it's very much a challenge on how can we get as much of this site to a restoration standard as possible. We also do that by making sure that our restoration work is upfront and concurrent. So you'll see here in the first years of construction, we're already working at how can we address those previous legacies to make sure that we're leaving the site better really at every stage of the project. And then through the 12 to 15 years of operation, we're still working on some of that legacy impact restoration, but we're also taking care of our own disturbances concurrently. So this is just a quick little chart to show how some of that work flows over time. Another way that we are reducing our footprint is 2 years ago, we made a dark skies commitment. And this came from collaboration with a prominent conservation group here in Idaho that had made dark skies preserves. And because our project is so remote, we thought to ourselves, well, there's got to be an industry standard for this. If cities and local businesses and homes can be smart about dark skies, well, so can we. And so we worked with a couple of dark skies experts to identify what we needed to be building in from our lighting plan to our operations and management of site to help us reduce our light footprint. And what we found was that using the right type of light, pointed in the right directions at the right time, so only when you need it, we could dramatically reduce our light footprint while also increasing employee safety because of concerns around glare. So really, it was a really cool win-win that helps us, again, meet that objective of reducing our footprint. As far as scale is concerned, as Haley mentioned, we will have 3 open pits on our site. There are 2 that exist right now, the Yellow Pine pit and Hanger Flats pit. Those are existing pits that we will dig deeper and wider, and west end. The Hanger Flats pit there in the middle on the top is currently the site of the historic smelter and tailings as well. And so, but that will become our 3rd open pit. To put it in the perspective of size, you can then see some other projects in Idaho, the existing Thompson Creek mine or the proposed Kumo mine in central Idaho as well, or of course Rio Tinto. And so this is just a map of scale that we use to help people understand the size of those pits and what it will look like. Our ore processing will not be heap leach. Instead, it is vat leach cyanide process. So ore will of course be crushed and ground, and then through a flotation process where the antimony will be taken off in a concentrate. And then through the gold cycle, we will be using cyanidization. The benefit of being able to do this inside a facility in double-lined containers is that once the gold has been removed, we are able to both dewater those tailings as much as possible and neutralize the cyanide, so that before our tailings are going out to the tailings facility, the level of cyanide is dropped down from 50 parts per million, which is considered the safe kind of line for wildlife. And our goal is really to get it down towards a 10 part per million, in part because the water in the tailings that are going out to the tailings facility, that water will be recycled back through our process. So if there were large amounts of active cyanide in that water, our flotation process wouldn't work. We wouldn't be able to recover the gold as necessary. So we're kind of doubly incentivized to make sure that that cyanide is reduced and neutralized. This is the footprint for our tailings facility. As you can see, 90% of it is contained by the existing mountain within the valley. That 10% wall then will be constructed with a downslope method, and then 65 million tons of waste rock, what you see as that buttress, will be placed up beside it. So right at that tailings dam line before the buttress, the design gets us, and it's fully lined, gets us to that 1.5 factor of safety as required by Idaho law. But by adding that buttress, we get to a factor of safety that's upwards between 3 and 4. So a really, really strong factor of safety and stability for the facility by adding on that buttress. Then you can also see that this is in the site of some of the existing tailings and spent ore, that soda Haley was talking about. So by utilizing this location for our tailings facility, it helps us have the ability to pick up and reprocess and repurpose those legacy tailings. A quick cross section, but many of the same points. So a downslope constructed tailings wall, and then those the buttress placed up beside it. So acid rock drainage is a question that we get a lot, whether or not we have acid rock drainage. And the answer is no. The site has been open, as you could see, for over 100 years, and acid rock drainage hasn't occurred. So it's one of those things we've also done some substantial testing around. So multiple years of trying to force conditions in hydraulic cell testing to see if we could force acid rock drainage to occur, and we can't. So it is a component that I know that many people in our community have been concerned about. So something that we try to answer right away. And I realized that I jumped right over, Haley, the question and answer section slide. So if we want to stop or pause at any point, we can do that if there are some questions coming in for you guys.
So it looks like we have one just off of that tailings storage facility slide, and then we have more coming in. But do you have plans of installing a seepage ponds for additional water recovery below the dam, is what the question was.
I'm not sure, but I know that's a question that our team is probably ready to provide the answer for, so we'd be more than happy to follow up with you.
We also have given a webinar on our tailings storage facility and our design with our senior civil engineer, Gene Bosley. So Larissa, I'm more than happy to send any extra details along there on kind of the design specs of what that looks like. Next one. Regarding lighting strategy, can someone talk a little bit more about what you're doing there? So I want to say this has to do with your dark skies slide, Mackenzie.
Yes. So you can find our full dark skies report at midasreport.com, where it's a full publication, or it links you to the publication of the report that talks very specifically about helping us identify the right type of lighting technology and when and where to place lighting. So there were many components that we evaluated on just simple waste that occurs already around lighting, where our tendency is to have lights that are really high up and shine out brightly, when in fact placing them lower down and pointing them downward can provide a lot more light to the right areas. And we don't need to light everything on site when we are operating 24 hours a day. Also looking at, motion sensors was another big component of how we use the right light at the right time. So we can dive more into that, but I would really encourage to look at that report, and we can send it out to everyone after this call to have that full deeper dive on the lighting policies we've developed.
Next question, is there a specific framework that Midas Gold is using, i.e. Envision, TSM, to meet its sustainability and resiliency goals?
Those are great questions. So we've actually just gone through a year-long process of evaluating kind of the ESG side of where we need to be reporting and which tool we need to be using. I will say that the company a number of years ago, I think, did the, oh, now I'm not remembering which report they picked, but they were following, I think, the TRI report. And now we're just evaluating going forward into the future, which is the most relevant for us to use. Particularly from a US basis, and now knowing that investor component, because we are a publicly traded company, many of the investment banks are really looking more towards known ESG reporting mechanisms. So we've established a component of our website where we try to consolidate all of the work we do around environmental sustainability, social responsibility, and good governance. So that's really where we're collecting everything right now. We do submit an annual sustainability report once a year that talks not just about some of the environmental metrics that we've met, like so far we've planted 60,000 trees to help burned areas of site recover and stabilize habitat, or some of the work Haley does in the community, but really also tell some of those stories from the community perspective. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of those things further on in the project. And if any of you have any suggestions on which tool you're finding most beneficial, we're open to hear it.
Next one, and this kind of comes back to one of our past slides about lands and kind of the project footprint, Mackenzie. But how are the lands held? Are they in fee, BLM, Forest Service?
Good question. So the mineral resources, so I think it's 90% of the areas that we will mine for gold and antimony are privately held lands. The rest is held by the U.S. Forest Service. It's predominantly it's a mixture of the Payette Forest and the Boise Forest, but they are U.S. Forest Service lands. Our biggest impact on public lands is that tailings facility, whereas our pits are predominantly within our private holdings.
Perfect. And then we have two more questions, but they are coming up in your next slide. So we will.
Oh, awesome. All right, where were we here? So public infrastructure. In order to get power up to site, we will need to upgrade the existing transmission line, or 73 miles of it, from its current 69 kV to a 138. And that also means upgrading a number of substations along the way. So a fairly big investment that will be taken on by Midas, but will have some local community benefits. Another big component of site is how we get there. So as I mentioned in the very beginning, there's a couple of different routes you can take. Both of those routes from Warm Lake Road, you either go down South Fork, which follows the South Fork of the Salmon River, parallels it, or you can take Johnson Creek, which parallels Johnson Creek. Both are extraordinarily sensitive fisheries and high recreational use areas. So we knew pretty quickly those were going to be challenges. And it was actually through a community meeting that someone suggested a different route. And it's the route that we've settled on, whereby we connect an existing but old logging route, the burnt log route, with a very old mining route, Thunder Mountain route. And we connect those two routes together here, and what you see in this red line. And there are a couple of miles in between where we have to connect them or move the existing road to really make sure that we're getting it out of wetlands or areas where we want to minimize impact. The beauty of this route is that we reduce interaction with recreational traffic or residential traffic, although there's very little. We get ourselves away from paralleling any major waterways. We cross a stream once or twice, and that's it. And then we're also getting the road up into a much higher part of the drainage, where typically every year there are avalanches and slide risks along the other routes. And by being able to use burnt log, we're really eliminating those risks as much as we can. So this is the road that we have suggested in and will be presented in the draft environmental impact statement alternative 2. Some of our other transportation planning, this is a big issue for people around the site. What we can do first is minimize traffic as much as possible. So we've suggested putting a logistics facility about 8 miles off of the turnoff from the highway on your road up to site that allows employees to park so that we can bus 90% of our workforce up to site for a 2-week on, 2-week off shift, reducing traffic substantially. We've also been able to reduce traffic by using that logistics facility as a point to consolidate loads and traffic to make sure that loads that are going up are as full as possible. We've also committed ourselves to, as much as possible, being able to concentrate our traffic through that logistics capabilities of that site by keeping it as Monday as Friday, kind of normal business hours as much as we can. So really focused on how we reduce any potential impacts. Through some changes in our plan submitted after we filed our plan, we've also identified some ways to reduce traffic by sourcing lime on site rather than having lime brought in, which really reduced our traffic about 23% overall. All right, fish passage.
We are going to stop again really fast just because there's a couple applicable questions. The Burnt Log Road, will this be through National Forest?
Yes, it is through National Forest. And there are interactions with roadless rules, just so everybody is clear. The roadless exemptions, though, for access to mine sites is the route that we're taking to be able to pursue this road upgrade. We will have to take down the road once operations are done, though.
Perfect. Next one is how many employees are going to be working on site? I know we're going to get to this later, but I just wanted to address it here.
Oh, that's a great question. So about 500 employees at a time, or to operate the project, and 2-week on, 2-week off shifts. We are planning full housing on site with access to recreation and 24-hour kitchen and all of those things you'd be used to if you're living out somewhere for 2 weeks. For about 250 people at a time is what we would anticipate up at Stibnite.
We also had a question that I slipped through earlier, but a question regarding antimony and if it was a toxic metal. Yeah, antimony is a toxic heavy metal, and it's part of the criteria. So through the NEPA process, why we have 11 overseeing local, state, and federal agencies and over 50 permits. So in the handling, processing, water, and all of that kind of comes into play there from an antimony perspective. There also is naturally occurring arsenic and mercury levels. So as we all know, in a very heavily mineralized zone, there are other things that come into effect there.
Yeah, and one of the impacts of those tailings being unlined at this point is that our baseline data has shown that particularly during runoff times, that leaching of arsenic and antimony into groundwater or surface water is a real threat to the region. So it's something that we're very cognizant of, and it's something that the site is suffering from today, and just another reason that it needs some proactive action.
Perfect. Okay, I think from a question perspective, we are covered. If you're good with me starting with fish.
Go for it.
All right, so regarding fisheries, so we talked a little bit earlier, kind of with the fish tunnel being a key component, but essentially with the Stibnite Gold Project, we have a company comprised of people that are Idahoans and people that are really focused on getting these fisheries, not just habitat from like a spawning and rearing perspective, but overall quality of improvement up at Stibnite. So regarding our conservation and protection goals when it comes to fisheries, overall, it's the restoration of volitional passage. So that's the early in mine process. So that's us building that fish tunnel during the construction timeline. So before we ever mine an ounce of gold, it's the restoration of the spawning and rearing habitat, not just in the East Fork of the South Fork of the Salmon River, but Meadow Creek as well. And it's also minimizing the incidental take of the ESA. So we have bull trout, Chinook, salmon, as well as steelhead in the East Fork and South Fork of the Salmon River, so at the Stibnite project. Right now, this is the current condition, so this is just a different view. So what you see, the blue, so this is the East Fork of the South Fork of the Salmon River flowing into right here that you see down below, that's the Yellow Pine Pit. So it's a pit lake currently. And then this yellow section is the fish barrier. So this is what's keeping the fish from being able to migrate upstream. Why this is a barrier, this is where we talked about essentially where they just put the East Fork of the South Fork of the Salmon River back through the open pit without actually restoring the area first. So it's much too steep and doesn't have the water flow that's required for passage. So our interim fish passage goals is that fish tunnel. So this fish tunnel is a 15-foot by 15-foot tunnel. It allows for passage up, but also juvenile passage back down. It's pretty considerable when you think about the components that come into it. So it's a 0.9-mile fish tunnel, and it's taken a lot of consideration and implication. So it's something that it has resting pools included into it. It also has lit, we had to evaluate whether it needed naturally lit sections, it needed lighting in general, but it's planned to be a lit, an LED lit tunnel. And of course, right in hand with fisheries is overall the river side of things. And so not only are we restoring fish passage early in the project, but we're also addressing what this component looks like in our project. And that's essentially, we're restoring over 12 miles of habitat, but we're also enhancing this habitat as well. So it's taking current conditions, so kind of that baseline of what Mackenzie talked about, like, so here's reclamation, what does restoration mean? And it's taking it above and beyond, ultimately opening another minimum 3.4 miles of new habitat up in this area. Go to our next slide. So obviously, as a geologist and a pretty proud Idahoan and fisher myself, one of the coolest part about our projects, I have to give kudos to our consultants, Rio, Applied Science and Engineering. They not only took a component of how can we make this better, but how can we make it the best? Meaning, so this is kind of the overall design of, we're not just putting the river back to where it's easy or where it flows, but really how can we restore this habitat? So that's those meanderings, those straight chutes, but also improving wetlands, spawning habitat, rearing habitat, kind of the full criteria here. So this is just a pretty great example of one of our local consultants that have really done some fantastic things on our project. So with the backfilling and restoration of the Yellow Pine Pit, this is a predominant area. So why we're addressing it early and giving it considerable time in our project is really the start and the solution from a river perspective and fishery goals. It revolves around the Yellow Pine Pit. So it's the backfilling of this year 7. So when we're still operating at other pits, we're letting that subside, gradating where it needs to be, and ultimately getting the river where it needs to be without any help from man-made or woman-made influences in the area.
Thanks, Ailey. I don't know, any other questions you want me to jump into or kind of wrap it up, and we'll pause at the end for questions.
We do have some questions. Are the fish edible? So drainage. So the entire watershed up there is entirely catch and release, a lot in due to the ESA component of the fish. There are people who, you know, historically that they've talked about fishing out of the Yellow Pine Pit and eating them directly out of the pit. As Mackenzie talked about with components to groundwater, so we also have surface water contamination, obviously from the arsenic and antimony side of things. But when we have fish that aren't necessarily staying in one designated location, but we have that where they're leaving, so they're leaving this watershed and returning, there's been associated studies with that. But happy to go in deeper offline. Next question, will the tunnel need to be oxygenated? And how will this be achieved? Have you considering adding fish cams? So Mackenzie, you can chime in here also. So essentially the tunnel itself, so it's an underground tunnel, but it's a 15 by 15 foot and it's a divergent, so it's not going to need to be oxygenated. So things that have to be considered for this tunnel outside of, you know, is it oxygenated? what about flow rates? So this tunnel has to be able to take differentials and flow rates. But also what happens if woody debris gets in there. So it's actually designed to have observation. So you mentioned the potential of fish cams. If we have fish cams, I might not be doing my day job because I will just be watching the spawning run. But a lot of these components, oxygenation level, temperature levels. So something else that we've had to take in through the NEPA process is climate change also. And what does that mean for stream temperatures and overall quality of the stream and river components?
And the river is flowing naturally. So there's, as Haley said, it's 15 by 15 feet wide with actually a road in it. Sometimes that road will act as a spillover. And I wish we had a cross section of the tunnel on this slide, but we don't. So we'll send it on. But to show kind of the high flow, low flow system of weirs also built into the tunnel to allow and accommodate for the burst speeds that each species needs and the time of year that they're coming up or going down as juveniles, and the water flow at that point. So it's really looked across the board at all species needs and best practices from around the world. And there is a deeper dive on the tunnel on our website. So I'll just talk really quickly so we can save some time at the end about why today, and this is something that you all know. This is my daughter, Georgia, when she was 2 or about 2. And in her lifetime at that point, she was going to use 3.3 million tons of minerals, metals, and fuels in her lifetime. And as we are consumers, we have an obligation to understand how and where those things that we consume come from. And there is a responsibility, I would argue, for those things to come closer from home, where we can watch the environmental conditions and control them, as well as the labor and other ethical considerations around these things that we use in our life every single day. We also have an incredibly robust permitting system here in the United States and a very high set of standards. So for our Stibnite Gold Project, as I mentioned, it was submitted to the forest in 2016. It will go through about 5 years of regulatory review. Right now, we anticipate that our draft environmental impact statement will be released on a week from Friday, sometime in the next couple of weeks, but most likely we're aiming for August 14th. This is after review from 11 local, state, and federal agencies. We're going to have to achieve and earn 50 permits to go along with that. And then, of course, set aside what will be more than $100 million in financial assurance to even get going. So those are standards that are good. That's what we want to be aiming for. In Idaho, we have a joint review process that allows our state, county, and county officials to work directly with federal officials through the NEPA process. So it's been very complex, but it allows us to really evaluate more collaboratively those different and oftentimes competing needs between agencies. So here's where we are right now in that NEPA permitting timeline. We are currently in the preparation of the draft EIS and are awaiting the notice in the Federal Register, hopefully in a couple of weeks, launching our public comment period. That would then put us to about a draft record of decision in 2021. And then we would be able to move forward once there's a final record of decision. So as mentioned, through that permitting process, we've made some refinements because we've been listening and we've been asked some really good questions as well. And through that process, we submitted back to the Forest Service over a year ago a modified plan of restoration and operations. Some of the things that this did was identified opportunities to divert water, to keep water cooler, to keep water cleaner. Also, as mentioned, reducing our traffic by generating lime on site from some limestone in the West End pit. We also identified a way to help recreational traffic get to where they're going safely, and made some changes to that burnt log route as outlined previously. This version, this modified Pro, what we think of as the most refined and best project to move forward, will be considered alternative 2 in the Forest Service's draft EIS. It does not sound like they're going to be having a preferred alternative. Overall timeline, get a record of decision in 2021. We'll have to go through a period of financing, 3 years of construction, and we'll see first commercial operations in 2026. Financial assurance as I mentioned, is a critical component of modern mining. So we've been arguing and advocating for a very long time for a true cost calculation for our financial assurance. And while the federal government has been doing that for a while, the state of Idaho has been slow to adapt until last year, when through advocacy from Midas Gold and the Idaho Mining Association, we were able to update Idaho's mining law, reclamation laws, to be able to confirm and solidify the use of a tool like CERC that many are familiar with. On the economic side of the project, as I mentioned, it's a $1 billion investment, and with a priority of hiring locally and contracting out services locally as well. So for the 2 to 3 year construction period, we anticipate 600 to 700 direct jobs at about 70,000. During the operating life, it's 500 to 600 jobs, around $80,000 for an annual wage. And then in the final years of reclamation and closure, it will go from about 200 to 50 employees. And then of course, the additional benefit to that is the indirect job creation as well, with a whole slew of opportunities for the workforce. So the great thing about this project is that it truly needs every kind of person with every background. So, you know, environmental engineers and biologists and river restoration folks and engineers and machine operators and cooks and hospitality experts are all going to be involved in the project. And to find out more, or if you're interested in a job or wanting alerts on that, if you go to Midas Gold Idaho /careers, you can sign into an intake form where we will alert people on those opportunities. And then, you know, overall, this is a pretty big impact to Idaho. So with over $230 million a year on expenditures for the project, hopefully most of those coming as locally as we can. And then that large tax impact as well of $506 million in federal direct, indirect, and induced benefits. So it's a big project, and there are many people that will be able to benefit from it. And especially when we're in a very rural county where there's a low median income, and there's a need for diversification of the economy. We get a lot of questions about this. I won't go over this, but this is kind of the ownership of our shareholders, et cetera. So if you have questions, we can go back to that slide. And then a little bit on community. The great thing about being here in Idaho is that folks in Idaho know natural resources, and they know that natural resources can be harvested in a way that's environmentally responsible. That's whether it's from agriculture or a history of mining. People in Idaho know this can be done the right way. And we also started a community agreement process about a year ago. We have 8 communities signed on to a binding long-term agreement for direct consultation and collaboration with the company. So it's a great opportunity for us to hear from the community about concerns or potential opportunities and needs as well. They meet on a monthly basis. They will invite us or others to the table to come talk and answer questions, and then they bring that information back to their communities. And finally, we need you. So as I mentioned, we are entering into a public comment period, and the voice of folks familiar with industry are extraordinarily helpful and very much needed. So we will have many offerings for folks to be able to help. But if you're interested in knowing more or in tracking the project, the easiest thing to do is to go to countidahoin.com, and we'll send you alerts when there's a comment period. We'll send you information on how to craft a letter or information that's in the DEIS if you want to know more about a specific topic. We'll connect you with that expert on our team. The thing that we pride ourselves on the most as my team is being transparent and helping to communicate and listen to the communities. And that's what we're here for. So throughout the process, we'll keep you informed, and we'll let you know how the project is doing. And we anticipate that the comment period will last for 45 days. So we're hoping that we count every single one of you in for supporting the Stibnite Gold Project through the comment period. And if we can ever be helpful to you, let us know. We do have more webinars coming up, but we'll send you a link after this to the deeper dives that we have, like on our tailing storage facility or offsite infrastructure. So just, it looks like these are out of date, but we will update you on all the ones coming up in the future. And I think that is it. Sorry to go a little bit over time. Haley, are there questions, or anybody else want to kind of, you know, provide us some feedback or have a question answered? We're happy to do that.
We do have some questions. Some are just deeper dives that we're going to need to answer offline. So Maria is actually going to do a conclusion for women in mining.
Yeah, we could share screens.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Mackenzie and Haley, for sharing today about the work you guys are doing up at Stibnite. That's pretty incredible to learn about. We really appreciate you guys taking the time. We want to thank everyone who joined us today too. So we're Women in Mining Arizona, and we're just trying to stay engaged with people virtually right now while we can, and keep everyone learning and supporting new projects. So this is our first Lunch and Learn we've done, so we'd love to get your feedback and hear how you thought we did. And also, we are looking for projects to feature. So if there's anything that you guys want us to highlight or want to learn more about and want to know if we can put together a webinar for it, we'd be happy to put that together. We do have coming up at the end of the month, our quarterly event is going to be on August 26th from 4:30 to 6 Arizona time. And we have Kara Festa, who's a former vice president over at Westland and who now is a executive coach. She's going to be talking about what we're calling tools for resilience. So, in this time, talking about ways to practice mindfulness and self-compassion and some stress relief. So we're really looking forward to that event. And then also, as always, we encourage you guys to become members so that you can continue to learn about us so that we can support you. And we're always looking for feedback on how we can continue to support our community. So our email is on our website, or you can reach out to any of us personally if you know us. And yeah, so we really appreciate you guys, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, everybody. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for your time. The follow-up email will be coming from myself. I'm sure that Women in Mining will be sending one as well. But we've had a lot of questions about additional resources and availability. I will send a follow-up that answers all of the questions from today, copy of the presentation, recordings of the presentations, and then deeper dives and updated schedules for more resources. So thank you again for your time, and have a fantastic rest of your day.
Thank you.
I mentioned this earlier, but I really wanted to thank Women in Mining for having us. This was a fantastic opportunity with a great group. And we love obviously talking about our projects. So if there's any other questions or avenues, we're always here. So thank you again.